Thank you so much to all the organizers, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be presenting alongside all of you. This is the first time I'm presenting this research, and so I'm really grateful for the opportunity as I'm kind of, new to this research career. The presentation today is called New and Repeated Memories, the Benefits and Challenges of Interviewing Aging Survivors, and obviously I realize all survivors now are aging, and mostly I'm going to focus on those who are experiencing memory loss as part of their aging process. And so I will get started. Basically, just to give you a little bit of background on my actual research, which I'll be covering just a small aspect of. As most of you already know, the Kindertransport took place between 1938 to 1940, where over 10,000 children left Nazi Germany, Central Europe, and specifically, I'm talking about the UK Kindertransport, and came to the UK. I became interested in this when I started researching and realized there was very little academic research on those who spent time in Wales specifically. There's research on the 600 kids that went to Scotland. There's some research on Northern Ireland and homes that were there, and the bulk is focused on England. And Wales being a very different, separate culture in the UK, with a separate language, a very proud history, and so I was curious on how children being exposed to this different culture, if that changed their experience. And how kind of that might have affected the second generation as well. And so kind of how those ideas of identity and belonging are transferred between generations. So that is a bit about what got me interested. And as I mentioned, there is little academic research on those based in Wales, but there are many memoirs, autobiographies. You can see the interviews that have been archived at the Association of Jewish Refugees, Refugee Voices Archive, at Fortunoff, USC, Shoah. And every year around Holocaust Memorial Day, you see the news articles in Wales Online, all the kind of online news outlets, where you do see their stories published. So when I started embarking on this project, I thought, do I really need to re-interview these people that have been interviewed before? Is that necessary? Will they want to be re-interviewed? And that kind of became a bigger question. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of using archived interviews because as an oral historian, we work so hard to create these interviews, and then they sit in archives and often are not used or utilized. And so that was kind of a big question. Obviously a lot of these people have spent time telling their story, and is that something that I want to approach? So before I kind of dive into that answer, I thought I would just visit a little bit of oral history theory and kind of terminology that helped me answer that. As we're at a conference focused on Holocaust testimony, I thought I would just touch a little bit on the idea of oral histories versus testimony. I'm a life history oral historian, which means basically what it sounds like. I start an interview by asking someone about where they were born, their family, and then it's a very open-ended process, leaving space for pauses, deep listening, and really allowing the interviewee to kind of lead the direction of the interview. I don't necessarily go in with a set list of questions, and kind of try not to have an idea of where the interview might go because you're usually surprised. Versus, my advisor, Rebecca Clifford, in her recent book, Survivors, wrote that testimony and the related term bearing witness have clear roots in a juridical context where witnesses to events set their memories out publicly, and it is hoped authentically, credibly, logically, and truthfully. And she speaks a lot to this, a lot about this in her book. But basically, the idea that, you know, child survivors specifically, when dealing with, you know, with their memories being nonlinear, experiencing, you know, they don't always remember things in a logical order. And so for them to be asked to give testimony is not always an easy thing, versus being able to openly tell their story in an oral history might be a more welcome experience. Because as she wrote, both speakers and listeners understand testimonies to be consistent and accurate narratives of past events. You know, in this context, I feel like both oral history, testimony, you know, the goal is to share people's stories, and I don't think that there needs to be a divide necessarily in, you know, that testimonies are not oral histories are not testimonies, but just that in the past, you know, there has been a huge difference in kind of how that is described. Which leads me into talking about intersubjectivity, and Alessandro Portelli, who is one of the most well-known oral historians from Italy, wrote that the whole difference between testimony and narrative being that the oral history interview is always ultimately about the life and subjectivity of the interviewee, and that an interview is basically an exchange of gazes between the interviewee, the interviewer, and that we believe that interviews are co-created, you know, obviously with someone different asking different questions, you're going to have a completely different interview, and that every interview is a kind of co-production between the two people. And so with all of that in mind, it became obvious that if people were open to being re-interviewed, that I would definitely want to, because, you know, it would be a different interview that would be produced, especially because I'm focusing on such a small kind of subject, being whales, that if people weren't asked about whales in previous interviews, that obviously me asking those questions would result in a completely different interview as the end result. So, that being said, most of what I'm going to talk about today is kind of a specific case study of one Kinder, B. Green.
My name is B. Green. It's actually short for Maria the Art Green, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So I've been reduced to B.
Yeah,
B-E-A.
Sorry about that. B. Green was born in 1925 in Munich, Germany. She came to England on a kinder transport in 1939 and settled with a family in South England. She spent 2 different periods of time in Wales, and one being when her school was evacuated, as many schools during the time were when the bombings were happening in London. And then again, when she attended the University College London, which the whole university was evacuated to Aberystwyth University. And so through the AJR, I was put in touch with one of B's sons. And he explained to me that she was very happy to speak with me, but she is hard of hearing now and experiencing memory loss. She still has a lot of her memories, but short-term memory is going, and you know, will repeat herself quite often in one conversation. But I was able to go to her home in London, and one of her sons was there as well during the interview. So one of the reasons why, obviously, I wanted to conduct these interviews is hoping that new memories would come to the surface, which was the case with B. As I have on this side, you know, the AJR Refugee Voices interview that she did in 2006 is a great resource, and, you know, covers, obviously, her whole experience of the kinder transport, but not a lot was specifically mentioned about Wales. There's a few anecdotes, but, you know, as far as Aberystwyth, not much about how she spent her time there. So I was curious if she had any memories specifically related to that.
You remember what you
did in your free time in Aberystwyth?
We went up and down the prom. Sometimes 2 or 3 of us, sometimes a few more. Oh, that's right, and you went to the end of the prom, and you did the traditional thing, you kicked the bar. There was a bar, a handle, sort of a rail on top of the stone base, and you had to kick with your foot to make sure you've been there. Kick bar. So that's what I did in Aberystwyth, apart from studying.
So I love this because it's a story that her son had never even heard before, which I was happy to hear that she does have memories she hasn't shared yet. And upon further research, the prom was only completed in 1870, and this is a traditional experience that people still do in Aberystwyth, and I loved that it kind of placed B within the context of Aberystwyth in the 1940s and this tradition that basically people use for good luck before an exam or good luck before a date. The lore of it has kind of stretched back, and people aren't sure exactly when it started, but it's nice to have this to place within the context of that. Another aspect of what I've realized is, obviously we know that the children don't remember their past in a completely linear way, and neither do the elderly. So those elderly suffering from memory loss. And so when we're thinking of child survivors who might be experiencing memory loss, for lack of a better term, it's kind of a double whammy. They, are trying to recall stories from so long ago that often that dovetails into a story, and you're jumping 20 years, 50 years, it just depends. And so I thought this was a good clip kind of illustrating that.
Do you remember the rowing that you did in Aberystwyth?
Oh yes, thank you. Of course, come spring and or summer or autumn, I can't remember which. But there was a UCL rowing club, and because back in Germany, Bavaria, we had a little house in Walchensee, which had a lake as well, and my parents had a boat called Beate. My name was on the boat, and I rowed. So I just rowed because from the boathouse we needed to go to the other side of the, well, it was the side, what we call it, an inlet, the other side, to do the swimming. This side is too steep and was traffic anyway. And I did my, what I was telling you about my
So rowing, did you row?
And so, right, so when we got to Aberystwyth, of course, I was the captain of the women's rowing club. Woo!
And yeah, I found that quote interesting, obviously, for a lot of reasons. Her son Jeremy was present during the interview, and he was able to help remind her of some things throughout. He was mostly silent, but was kind of sitting there, and sometimes would physically shake his head if he knew something wasn't quite right that she said. But but then also was excited to hear some stories he hadn't heard before. And I found it interesting that in order for her to tell the story about rowing while she was at university, she needed to first travel back to her childhood and explain that she had enjoyed and learned to row then, and then kind of got a bit lost coming back to what she had started talking about. And so I thought that was a really perfect example of kind of how you just have to follow the interviewee as they tell their story. And so then just a few other benefits I found of re-interviewing. As I mentioned, she has done multiple interviews. Her story is featured at the Imperial War Museum. And, she's interviewed with the BBC, various archives, and in some of those cases, it did come in handy that I was able to read those and listen to those before meeting her, as you'll hear here.
The name of the nearest town escapes me. If you mention somewhere in the central Wales.
Well, I was able to listen to one of your other interviews. I think you mentioned Brynwyllia Hall.
Brynwyllia Hall! Oh, yes. We wound up. That was still with the school. The headmistress had booked, I suppose, at a distance place. And so we had mattresses on the floor, if they could be found. I think I slept, they hadn't got enough mattresses, so I had a couple of blankets underneath. But I didn't mind, it was for wartime.
And then, obviously some memories, as I mentioned, did come up more than once, and her son, told me to expect that. And just a few things that did come up throughout are just short hour together. She's very proud to be from Bavaria and kind of refers to herself as a Bavarian British Jew. And is, if it's not Bavaria, to her, it's Prussia. And so that came up quite often throughout the interview. Also frequently refers to Adolf Hitler as that shitty bastard, multiple times throughout the interview. And probably my favorite, because of what my research focused on, is kind of her explanation of how she was welcomed into Wales.
I absolutely adored Wales because, first of all, they didn't bother about me not being Welsh because all the kids were English. The fact that I was German, they thought was rather nice. Not English. That was a difficulty sometimes between the two nations.
And so, yeah, as I mentioned, there's definitely historical differences still between Wales and England, and the fact that she wasn't English, like her schoolmates that she was with, the Welsh children seemed to enjoy. So, just in closing, as I mentioned, when someone is willing to tell their story and to be re-interviewed again, I think it is completely worth it, and that the fact that there are still stories that we haven't recorded now, I think it's even with memory loss, there can still be some kind of memories that come to the surface, and I'm just really grateful that I was able to record that and to have all of those archived now. So thank you so much.